We'll get started. So welcome once again to our Careers in Higher Education Administration panel. And I am going to very quickly turn it over to the panelists to introduce themselves, but each of them has a PhD in a different discipline and has found themselves in a career in higher education administration in a different part of Columbia University or Barnard College. Welcome and thank you so much, panelists, for joining us today. So I'm just going to go one by one and have you first start by telling us about your current role and what you currently do at the university. Let's start with Kwame Osei-Sarfo. Can you get us started?
Sure, wasn't expecting to be first, but that's okay. Welcome everyone. Hope everyone has had a great weekend, ready to get the week started. But at Columbia University, I direct the Bridge to the PhD program in STEM, and pretty much this program is a 2-year post-bac program where, excuse me, where we help scholars become more prepared for graduate school. So what they do, they come to Columbia, they take courses for 2 years, they conduct research for 2 years, and hopefully with those experiences, they become, awesome graduate candidates. And pretty much I run the day-to-day activities of the program, as well as participate in the hiring, the recruiting, the onboarding. So everything that's associated with Bridge, I pretty much do.
Great, thanks, Kwame. Natalie, can we go to you next? Natalie Nevarez.
Hi, everyone. Natalie Nevarez. I use she, her pronouns. I currently serve as Associate Director for Faculty Diversity and Development. So that's for arts and sciences. So I develop and I oversee all the strategic management of arts and sciences efforts to promote diversity and professional development of our faculty. And that involves kind of managing faculty award programs, orientations, events that guide the work of the Committee on Equity and Diversity and the Graduate Equity Initiative right now.
Thanks. Chris Barthel.
Hi, my name is Chris Barthel. My title is Director of Faculty Support Services in the Provost Office at Barnard College. And my role is to oversee and coordinate essentially all types of faculty reviews. That's tenure reviews, promotion to full professor, lecturer associate, reappointment reviews, those types of things. And a lot of other things that come through the college's promotion and appointments committee, like teaching awards and rotating endowed professorships and that sort of thing. So my titles in higher ed usually don't tell you a whole lot about the role, but the word support in mine speaks to kind of the role that I play in almost a kind of advocacy role, just sort of helping to make sure not just that procedure is followed, but that any candidate coming up for review is kind of in the best position to have a good outcome. So that's the quick overview.
And Kristy Barbacane.
Hi, I'm Kristy Barbacane. I am an assistant dean in the School of General Studies, and I focus on academic advising. That means I advise undergraduates from their first year, first coming to Columbia to graduation, and often talk to them about post-graduation plans. In my role, I also teach the course University Studies, which is required of all first semester general studies students. And so helping with the curriculum and then teaching that course as well, helping our students transition, because a lot of our students are coming back to college from a break. So helping them transition back into academia and the academic environment.
Great, thank you. So you all have pretty different roles. And the next question I'll ask each of you to share is, how did you get to where you currently are from your PhD? So if you could share what you did your PhD in, and then maybe the medium length version of that story, how you found yourself here, starting with as far back as you want to go during your time in graduate school. Let's switch up the order for fun. Natalie, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, so my PhD is in behavioral neuroscience. I worked with animals, specifically prairie voles, looking at the overlapping brain circuitry for monogamy and addictive behavior. There is a lot of overlap. So that was what I focused in, but during my whole graduate career and a long time before my graduate career, I had been very involved in diversity efforts at every level I had been in. So when I was an undergrad, advocating for undergrads, when I was a graduate student, advocating for graduate students, and when I was a postdoc, advocating for postdocs. Some of those things were more formal in nature than others. So, and it also kind of depended on the mentors that I had in graduate school. Some of them were more open or less open to me doing the advocacy work on the side. So when I was in graduate school, I started an organization called Myelin. So since I was a neuroscientist, myelin is this fatty covering in neurons, but it stood for Mentoring Youth and Early Leaders in Neuroscience. So I started that organization, which was for low-income kids in Ann Arbor to have exposure to science. And then through my time in graduate school, I was also involved in just a lot of different committees. And again, my mentors were kind of, different mentors felt differently about my committee work, but it was something that I personally, like, I couldn't separate. Like, that to me is part of being an academic, is something that was very important to me. So I served on like graduate curriculum committee, graduate success committee, faculty hiring committee, other smaller kind of department level committees. And then when I became a postdoc, I went to Stanford University, where I did a postdoc in psychiatry. And while I was there, I started the Stanford Latinx Postdocs, which was the first Latinx postdoc association in the country, but the second affinity org in the country. The first one was Black postdocs at Stanford. So I did that there, and I also served at a university level committee there, which was a hiring committee for the vice provost for graduate education and postdoctoral affairs. And I think that that is really kind of where I made my decision that I really enjoyed administration, that higher level committee where you got to see, we interviewed people from across the university to see kind of what they would want in a VPGE. And that was something that I really enjoyed doing. It was definitely kind of a little bit more of a, sorry, my cat is whining in the back. There's a bird. So yeah, you get to hear kind of from all the different stakeholders, but there were also kind of, I would say, a lot of kind of political considerations in mind. And I know that at least in STEM, a lot of people kind of hate those aspects, like that level of bureaucracy. And I found that I actually kind of enjoyed being in those spaces and learning about people and the different things that are motivating the work and like their interests for who they would want to advocate for. So that's when I started thinking more seriously about being in administration. And then during that time, I was also working with two nonprofits, so 500 Women Scientists, where I sit on the advisory board, and I was running a fellowship program for them called the Fellowship for the Future, which is a fellowship for women of color doing diversity work in STEM. And then working with SACNAS on the government relations and development committees, so doing fundraising and then writing policy briefs and lobbying for science forward policy for people of color. So, you know, obviously I like to be on committees. So if you like to be on committees, I think that that was kind of one of the pieces where I was like, okay, like this is I like working in large groups, which isn't different than being in science, but it's in science, you can have kind of a lot of solitary moments, at least in the work that I was doing, where you work independently for a long time. Whereas now, like, committee work is the bulk of what I do. So that's kind of how I ended up applying to this job. And I joined about a year, actually almost exactly a year ago now.
Thank you. Chris, let's move to you next. How did you get to where you currently are?
Sure. I apologize in advance if a cat makes some noises. It's a distinct possibility. So my PhD is in modern German history, and I can't say I had much of a plan for what to do after finishing it. And so my PhD was at Brown, and so I taught there a year after I finished. And then I was unemployed living in New York City. So I started volunteering at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. It's a Holocaust Jewish cultural institution. So my background in German history was sort of relevant there, and I was volunteering on some projects related to exhibitions they were developing. And then that turned into a part-time job working on a fellowship program that they had called Fellowships at Auschwitz for the Study of Professional Ethics. I think it's now sort of independent. It's not at the museum anymore, but it was a program for students in law, journalism, seminarians, and medical students. Now they've expanded to business students too, I think, to learn about the professional ethics of each field during the Holocaust, of their respective fields. So it was a summer program for a few weeks. And so there was faculty mentors who led the program and created the syllabus and that sort of thing. So I was involved in the administrative side of that. So it was my first step into the world of administration. I was working for a relatively small nonprofit, and then FASB, which was program acronym, sort of within the nonprofit, was even smaller. So it was kind of a smaller organization, but getting to work on applications, recruitment, advertising, and then all aspects of logistics and organization of the trips. And at that time, I was also working at the Writing Center of St. Joseph's College in Brooklyn. And then a couple years later, a year and a half later, I guess, I applied for and received an ACLS public fellowship at the Center for Jewish History. The Center for Jewish History is an umbrella organization that houses 5 Jewish cultural institutions, each of which has archival holdings, sort of museum collections. They hold public programs. And so I worked for the umbrella organization, which does its own programming and also has a fellowship program. So that was kind of the direct tie-in there, is that I had experience working for a fellowship program, and I'm sure that experience was important to my having received the ACLS fellowship. And I was at the Center for Jewish History for 4 years. And again, it was a small nonprofit. And I think there's some pluses and minuses to that. It was nice to be able to be pretty connected to history there. For example, the 100th anniversary of the start of the First World War, we created an exhibition on the experience of German Jews during the war. So I had some direct background with that in my own research. So I got to help craft that using materials from the archival holdings. Put on a lot of public programs. So working with scholars for panel discussions, scholarly conferences, more sort of public-facing events, just about a new book on a related topic or things like that. And then all aspects of the fellowship program, sort of mentoring, advising, representing the Center for Jewish History at the Association for Jewish Studies conference. So after 4 years, I moved on to my current role at Barnard College. And I remember being asked in my interview, sort of, what you're doing now is very different from this position. And my answer, which I think turned out to be correct, is that the sort of working with faculty to sort of, on the outside, sort of being an administrator to the process of sort of evaluating applications in the case, fellowship applications in the case of the Center for Jewish History, and then tenure dossiers, other faculty reviewed dossiers in my current position. That was a line running through both positions. So now at Barnard College, as I gave you a very brief overview. So it's interesting to be able to see into a lot of different fields. I'm not, my role is not primarily, my role really isn't to evaluate the materials. I coordinate, I bring things to the committee that reviews them. I report directly to the Barnard Provost, so it's interesting to have that insight into how she operates, her basis of making decisions, and to kind of, I'd like to think I play a very helpful role in bringing things to her attention, making sure that there's good coordination between the faculty and her and the committee that works on promotions and appointments. So that's my general progression. I wouldn't say that there was any indication when I finished grad school that this is where I would be 10 years later. We can talk more about that in the Q&A and breakout sessions, but that's the broad overview.
Great, thanks, Chris. Kristy, you go next.
So I finished my PhD in historical musicology at Columbia, or music history. And when I completed my degree, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I wound up getting a lecturer position at Barnard teaching music history classes that I was really excited about. I loved teaching. And when they asked me, when I started that position, they asked me to advise some first and second year students. So at Barnard College, academic advising is done actually by the faculty. And so first and second year students haven't declared a major yet, so any faculty can advise these students. And so I said, sure, I would be happy to do that. And I really enjoyed getting to know students one-on-one. I felt that you got to know students in a new way, that you didn't get to know them in the classroom. I got to know the behind the scenes of what was going on, what brought them to college, what other things were going on in their lives that, in the classroom that just doesn't come up in discussion most of the time. And I enjoyed really building and fostering those relationships with students and thought this is something I think I'd like to do. Hadn't realized that there's a whole career in academic advising, and applied to be an advising dean for the Columbia College of Engineering. And so I was there for 5 years at the Center for Student Advising in Lerner Hall, loved advising students, loved building relationships with them. And now I'm an assistant dean at the School of General Studies doing academic advising for general studies students. It's really fun to get to know general studies students just because they are unique. They're not the traditional 18-year-olds coming right from high school. So we have students from all walks of life. And when I taught as a grad student too, I loved having general studies students because they bring this richness of their own experiences to the classroom. So that's really exciting. Yeah, and then my teaching experience, I think, teaching both music humanities and then teaching at Barnard. And I also taught for a semester at Fordham, really helped, I think, inform just knowing how, knowing the student side of things, but also knowing the professor and instructor side of things, I think can be really helpful when you're working with students, because students don't always think of it from that perspective. So being able to talk to students about how a professor views something, how to broker and mediate relationships with students and professors has been helpful. And then also in teaching the university studies course, I think my teaching experience has been helpful.
Great, thank you. And Kwame.
Yes, so I kind of I'm gonna mirror what Chris mentioned. Like when I was finishing my PhD, I had no idea 10 years from now I would be in this position I am. But I'll start back in, well, let's say 2010, when I was finishing up my PhD work at NYU. More specifically, I have my PhD in molecular oncology and immunology. I did research on various types of leukemias, lymphomas. But while I was in grad school, I mean, obviously I was doing science, but I wasn't really sure if I loved science. So during that time, I participated in a lot of K through 16 initiatives, so a lot of volunteer work. I worked for a bit at the Harlem Children's Zone. Don't tell anyone because I wasn't supposed to be working as a graduate student at NYU. And so I kind of really fell in love, if you will, with education. But as I was finishing up my PhD, I figured, okay, I have to do a postdoc so I can figure out what I actually want to do with my life. So I started my postdoc at Weill Cornell Medical College. Actually, I think it's called Weill Cornell Medicine now. And in my postdoc, I basically looked for potential biomarkers in various types of oral cancers, and also did research to kind of characterize embryonic stem cell biology. But while I was at Weill Cornell, I started adjuncting. So I adjunct at John Jay in New York City College of Technology, and I just actually fell in love with being in the classroom and actually engaging with students. And I kind of felt, although I was doing biomedical research with education, I had more of a direct impact in the progression of, student lives. Because yes, you can do research in cancer and figure out what this protein is going to do and how to, I guess, knock down this protein. But, would I have a direct impact with that? It would take, decades if, something goes from preclinical work to clinical work to actually being approved for a drug. So that kind of, at that point, that's where I was kind of thinking, oh, maybe I could actually do this teaching thing or move into education. So towards the end of my postdoc, I applied for faculty positions and I didn't get any. So that kind of was a shock to my system. At that point, I was just kind of like, well, I guess I'm not made out for the education world. So, I'll just remain a scientist. So then I moved into a lead scientific role in biotech. And in that role, I was pretty much doing drug screening for various compounds that would be targeting different types of cancer. So colon cancer, prostate cancer, melanoma. But while I was in that role, I still didn't love what I was doing. And you'll probably hear me say this a bunch of times today. So this is the importance of informal interviewing. So I went to LinkedIn and just pretty much did a search on folks who had PhDs in biomedical sciences and doing things in either administration or in academia. And I chatted with one person who kind of does something similar to what I do, but at Hunter College. And we were having a conversation, and then randomly she's like, "Oh, I'm on this diversity officers mailing list, and this job came up on the list for Columbia University." I was like, "Okay, well, let me try it." So I actually applied to it, not thinking I was going to get it at all, because I think this was like in July. So I figured if this job posting has been out, it's July, they probably already have hired someone. And lo and behold, they actually called me for an interview. So I was kind of shocked that, like, oh, actually, I guess they hadn't hired anyone. So I did the interview. And one of the things I liked with the interview is, although I was chatting with different faculty members and administrators at Columbia, they actually asked students who were in the program to interview me. And I'll say the students' questions were a lot tougher than the administrators' questions. And that's pretty much how I ended up here. So at the end of grad school, I had no idea that, my career would kind of take a couple of turns. But I'm happy for, all of the experiences, especially with the volunteer work, because even though, I didn't have a job as an administrator, a lot of the things I did in grad school during my postdoc, they had a lot of transferable aspects to it that I think helped make me a bit qualified for the current position I'm in now.
Great, thank you so much. I feel like all of you had a sort of paradoxical combination of, you had no idea this is where you would be, yet in hindsight, it all makes sense. And all the pieces were kind of there along the way to get you where you currently are. So before opening it up to questions from the audience for all of you, just really, really quickly, actually, I want to piggyback on what Kwame ended with, which is if you could all say, just very short, really very briefly, reflecting on your graduate school experience in particular. And I know there are many other things and aspects of your experience that have gotten you to where you are today, but what experience, skills, knowledge do you think stands out as being most useful that you actually use, whether day to day or in a big picture way in your current roles? And I know some of you might have a ready answer to that and some of you might not. So anybody, any of the panelists want to volunteer to say first what in reflecting on that? Yeah, Natalie.
Yeah, I can jump in, and I can imagine that these might be different for all of us because I can see that we're interfacing kind of with different groups. I think for me, it is data. So working with data and presenting data to people, because if I need to make the argument that, our departments are not diverse enough, just saying that it won't get me very far unless I can show people, well, this is how it's looked across X amount of years, and be able to show people those numbers. And so I've been lucky that in my role there, I have a counterpart, a colleague who has essentially my position, but he works with all the data. And so when I need that information, I'm able to tap him and say, okay, I need something and it should look kind of like this, and he can do the magic. And then I need to report it out. And then sometimes we do work together to kind of put those numbers together and figure out how to present things.
Great. Kwame, saw your hand first.
I would say from all of my experiences, definitely project management, and this probably is a little bit what Natalie was mentioning, because although I'm not doing scientific experiments now, but oftentimes I would have to keep track. Okay, what did I do? What has been done? What should I do next? So I think a lot with my day to day, definitely project management is a big check.
Chris, I think I saw your hand go up too.
Yeah. For me, I'd say it's a more general just understanding of what academia is. What within the humanities, especially sort of, what do publications mean in that sort of a career progression, that type of thing. What are the expectations of a tenure track job, et cetera. I might not be thinking about this the right way, but in my day-to-day, in terms of the skills I use to get my job done, I don't really think of that as really having derived a whole lot from the writing and research I did. It's more just that general understanding of what it means to be in the academy. Although certainly having writing skills is a huge asset, but for me, that's kind of a chicken and egg question. It's like, if there's so many careers that PhDs end up in outside of the academy. The PhD itself isn't, to my mind at least, it's not as though one needed those particular skills, needed to get the PhD in order to gain those skills. They may have come about as a consequence of getting the PhD, or they just sort of heightened, for example, writing ability and organizational ability, that type of thing. Maybe you've proven that you can write a dissertation, but it's, you know, the PhD prepares you to do one specific thing. And if you're able to use it to do other things, that's fantastic, but it's not really what it's designed for.
Yeah, Kristy.
So it's hard to pin down one thing. I would say my research and writing, I feel very much prepared me for and helps me day to day in my work, because I talk with students. The bulk of my job is talking with students, which I love. And I talk to them about the classes they're taking. I talk to them about how to approach hard readings. I talk about their senior theses, and we can get into philosophical discussions on post-colonial theory, or whatever they're talking about. And I love learning what their research is about and sharing my knowledge and experiences with research as well. Another thing that comes to mind is I was very involved in graduate student government I went to Columbia for GSAS, and that really helped me in seeing some of the behind the scenes in administration, and also how to liaise with other administrators. I think that really gave me a window into the higher administration that I didn't have the knowledge of just as a graduate student.
Great, thank you. So now let's open it up to questions from you all. And remember, the way this is going to go is we'll do a Q&A all together for about 15 minutes or so, and then you will have an opportunity to go into breakout rooms if you have kind of more specific questions or things you want to talk about with particular panelists. But